Welcome to the Shadow Warrior podcast. I'm the host, Rajiv Srinivasan, a columnist and a professor of innovation and strategy in India. Episode 97 is titled Judiciary Problems as a Symptom of the End of the Liberal World Order. So, here I'm going to talk about several things, all related to the judiciary. First, you're all aware that in India, we've had this issue of the judiciary disqualifying Rahul Gandhi from parliament. Meanwhile, in the US, you have Donald Trump being indicted and having the dubious honor of being the first ex-president to be indicted in a criminal offense. And then over in Israel, you've got these large protests against some proposed changes to the judiciary there. So to link these things, these episodes, I thought I'd look at three things. One is, what are the legal implications of what's going on in Israel and the parallels with India? The second is, what are the interesting social implications or social parallels between Israel and India, especially in this context of the judiciary and the riots that are ongoing in their capital? And incidentally, the Knesset or Parliament of Israel, the head of that was in India on a short visit, which is interesting, although it may be incidental. And finally, to take a look at how this may affect the whole business of Pax Americana, the liberal international rules-based order that everybody has been talking about. So while we're doing that, let me see if I can. It's always a little iffy. Let me see if I can bring these slides on board. Okay, let me share my slides here. I have just a few slides. All right, so here we go. So let me share the slideshow version. India, Israel, and the judiciary and the world order. The first thing that I thought was quite interesting, as mentioned by this Twitter handle Hindu Hate, is that the reaction of the West, and in particular the media, and these are both screenshots from The Economist, where on the one hand, when the judiciary is under some threat of being reformed, well, that's a bad thing, okay? And then and that's because Israel is interfering in the judiciary, as this Twitter handle says. But then in India, the government did not interfere with what the judiciary did. Of course, as they say in India, let the law take its course. So the law is taking its course, but that's also bad because that means the biggest democracy is becoming less free, according to The Economist. So essentially, these guys are talking out of both sides of their mouth, but that's to be expected. So what is the real issue here? Israel has a judiciary that is, by all accounts, essentially running rampant, judicial overreach, judicial activism, all these things, and their control over many things that the government should properly manage is rampant. And as a result, the incoming or recently elected Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to make some changes, and that has led to massive riots there. And I wrote an article about this, giving a detailed comparison of the kinds of things that the Israeli reforms would do and how they look in relation to what India has. And there are many points in common. I won't go into any detail about them. But the fact that these judicial reforms are being opposed on a large scale in Israel, and there are massive protests, is interesting because it seems to me that some of these same sort of toolkit items will be in effect in India as well, especially if and when India does some judicial reforms, but of course, also as part of the toolkit for regime change. So that's something that the two countries have in common. There are these malign influences from outside that are looking to change or to prevent any change to the judiciary. The second is that, in Israel, I've been observing it closely. There are many groups, including army reservists, who are generally apolitical. And Israel, as you probably know, has the compulsory draft. So a large number of their population are army people who've gone through the army and are reservists. So they have traditionally not made any noise on the political side, but this time they did, and they too joined the protests. And secondly, the tech industry, which is quite large in Israel, they also came down very strongly on the side of opposing these reforms. So these are just interesting points to note. And what this suggests is that there is a social angle to this as well. And that's where, again, the parallel with India is quite interesting because in Israel, there are these two groups. One is the Ashkenazi, and the other is the Sephardim. Ashkenazi are the European Jews, generally white and liberal, and they were the guys who originally came up with the idea of Zionism. And obviously, they suffered a lot in Europe and under various programs and their Holocaust and so forth. So they were the ones who really pushed for the establishment of the Israeli state, and they came in and they were the elites and they ran the place all these years. Now, however, the non-white, non-European, maybe North African and Arab origin, anyway, non-white Jews who are called the Sephardim, they are actually more numerous. They've been somewhat under the thumb of the Ashkenazi. Now they are getting to be more assertive, and they're apparently quite conservative. So the current government, the Benjamin Netanyahu government, depends on these sort of far-right parties that I believe are Sephardic in their core constituencies to survive. And therefore, he is catering to their desires. Now, there are some parallels, very clear parallels with India as well, because we have what my friend Baparao calls the Anglo-Mughalai. These are the people who have been the traditional elites. They hung out. They were compradors to the Muslim or the Christian invaders, and they got zamindaris and other mechanisms where they became traditionally rich. And there are people that you know of, the ancestors of the Thapar dynasty, the Romila Thapar, and her ancestors. There's this guy named Sobha Singh in Punjab, or he incidentally became infamous for giving a purse of gold to Gerald Dyer after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So these are people who were very friendly with the British and collaborators basically. But it's their descendants, and especially those of the upper jatis who have dominated the discourse in India. These are the people who are the bulk of the Luthians as well as the Khan Market gang. So they have been in control regardless of which party was in power, and that's a good place to be. But now they're finding that some of those traditional privileges are going away because the Bahujan, I guess that's the umbrella term for OBC and SC/ST, are beginning to surge, and they're beginning to come into positions of power. So there is this parallel between Israel and India on the social side as well. Now, moving on, there's an interesting comment by the Israeli former prime minister saying that just a small percentage of the population is enough to hold the rest of the country hostage, and that's probably what's happening here, the small minority. And this is something that we have seen in India with the Shaheen Bagh and the farmer riots, which was extremely small percentage of the population. They were able to essentially thwart the will of the central government. So there is that aspect to it and Nassim Taleb calls this the tyranny of the stubborn minority. So it's entirely possible that we'll see this kind of action in India going forward, especially in view of the 2024 elections. It's also interesting that, as you all know, the expulsion of Rahul Gandhi had nothing to do with the government. Government is completely absent in that. It was simply a statute that had been written into the law that said if someone's disqualified for 2 years, someone's convicted of an offense that carries a prison sentence of more than 2 years, they're automatically and immediately disqualified from parliament. In fact, there have been a number of people, I believe some 16 people who have MPs who have been thus disqualified. And I remember in particular, there were some people who were disqualified by the Somnath Mukherjee speakership when there was this cash for vote scandal. And I think it's under the same statute. But in any case, there are precedents for this. So it was something that was done entirely as part of the judicial process. And the ironic thing is that there was a government order. There was I forgot the term for it, but there was an executive order that was going to negate this. And Rahul Gandhi himself, very publicly a few years ago, tore that executive order in Parliament, and it did not pass. Okay, so it's funny in a way that it has come back to bite him. But the fact is that this has nothing to do with the government, but the spin. This is from the New York Times. The spin absolutely is that Modi is now preventing a leader of the opposition or the leader of the opposition, although that's also not technically correct, from being in parliament. So this is to be expected. I, in fact, said exactly this. I said they would spin it in this way, blaming Modi. Of course, that's part of the usual routine for the New York Times. And moving on to the final point I wanted to make, the international order is sort of in tatters. We've seen this partly because of the various wars and the sanctions, and people are now trying to get around the sanctions by, in fact, doing something quite damaging to the US, which is to move away from the dollar as the reserve currency. So that's happening. And then the entire fuss about Silicon Valley Bank and the US banking system being a little bit dicey, and the contagion that spread to Switzerland and maybe Deutsche Bank in Germany, etc. So all this is literally causing a loss of confidence in the ability of the US to continue to be sort of the adult in the room, which is what the Pax Americana has meant. And here is William, I forgot what his last name is, okay, Professor W.R. Mead, a very astute observer of international politics, saying that, look, this has implications. If many allies and neutral people begin to believe that Pax Americana is coming to an end, well, then they'll make other plans. And unfortunately, the only thing on offer at this point is Pax Sinica, and you're seeing how China is now making inroads into the Middle East. They brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and this is a cause for concern. Now, what does this mean for India? It means that we will now need to do a Pax Indica by increasing our military capability, especially submarines and surface ships. We'll have to build a substantially bigger navy to control the Indian Ocean and the littorals. So that is East Africa and Southeast Asia, and the Straits of Malacca, through which a lot of the oil trade happens, as well as other merchandise trade. So what this suggests is that, if the judiciary's problems around the world are a symptom, as I claim, of the general decline of the existing liberal rules-based international order, i.e. Pax Americana, well, it would not be a nice idea for us to go for Pax Sinica, which then means that we, India, will have to invest in Pax Indica. So with that, I think I'll conclude. Thank you very much for listening.